Will Michael Penix's arm strength and athleticism raise the ceiling for the Falcons offense in 2025?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So, guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer that goes strong with me and makes this podcast your first listen each and every day. All you have to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we're talking all about Michael Penix, especially in comparison to Kirk Cousins, talking about the 3 A's. Right? Athleticism, accuracy, and arm strength. And leading up to Kirk Cousins benching, one of my more controversial takes was that regardless of how the 2024 season finished for the Atlanta Falcons, I believe that in order for this offense to put their best foot forward in 2025 and build off of however they finished 2024, that you had a greater potential to reach that goal of potentially being a top 10 offense in 2025 by having a second season of Kirk Cousins that you could build off of that rather than going through the ups and downs of a first full season under Michael Penix as a starter. And I still do believe that statement, but I don't have the same conviction that I had when I made that statement roughly a month ago, mostly because Michael Penix, I think, outperformed my expectations in his first 3 starts. But I still think it's true that the Falcons do need to try to maximize their potential to reach that ceiling of being a top 10 offense, to maximize their chances of making the playoffs this upcoming season. And again, we'll explore this more as the offseason unfolds when we get, a new defensive coordinator hire. And, basically it's the idea of the more improvement the defense makes, the less we'll need the offense to have to carry the team. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I was not as high on the notion of Michael Penix, just because, usually a first-year quarterback, unless he's CJ Stroud, usually isn't capable of carrying the quarterback. And so that's where that sort of came from. But, until we get sort of more information on what direction this defense is headed, we'll just sort of continue to make the assumption that this will still be a below average defense this upcoming season. And so we'll still need the offense to sort of have to, reach its peak in order for this team to have their best chance of success in 2025. So today I want to explore sort of all the reasons why Michael Penix gives the Falcons potentially more than Kirk Cousins, where that take will age poorly, where this offense will reach that top 10 potential in year 1 under Michael Penix, and all the reasons why that could happen. And, we're going to spend the next 7-8 months talking. You're going to hear a lot about sort of the potential and the ceiling of this offense under Michael Penix. And I think, let's explore that. And I think one of the biggest reasons for why people will be optimistic about what this offense can be under Michael Penix is due to the arm strength, something that Penix has in abundance that Kirk Cousins did not have at this stage in his career. And never, Kirk never was a weak-armed quarterback, but never was a big-time armed quarterback, right? That's a big reason why he went in the 4th round originally, 12 years ago. But, that big arm strength leads to, matters because of the explosive potential that it brings to the table offensively. That ability to attack vertically outside the numbers is greater with Michael Penix, and we saw flashes of that in the final 3 games. Now, to Kirk Cousins' credit, he was probably more effective throwing down the field this year than I think a lot of people would have assumed he was, right? When you just look at throws on intermediate throws, 10-plus yards, or deep throws, 20-plus yards, outside the numbers, according to Next Gen Stats, Kirk Cousins' success rate on those throws this year was 44%. Michael Penix's success rate on those throws, 44%. And if you look at the percentage of those throws that wound up being explosive plays, 20-plus yard plays, that number was 25% for Kirk Cousins, and that number was 24% for Michael Penix. So it's not as if Kirk Cousins was really underperforming when it came to throwing the ball down the field, and suddenly Penix comes into the offense and like this is an element that didn't exist in the Falcons offense. No, it was an element that already existed in the Falcons offense. And a lot of Kirk's issues this year was throwing over the middle of the field, which was the alleged strength of his game. That's where the vast majority of his interceptions came this year. And we'll explore that further when we get to a Zach Robinson conversation, perhaps tomorrow or later this week on the podcast. But, the stat that does differentiate when we talk about outside the numbers with Kirk and Penix is the percent of times he was throwing the ball outside the numbers, right? The intermediate deep throws outside the numbers, 32% of Penix's attempts qualified as those types of throws, where that was only 16% of Kirk Cousins' throws. And so it's basically the idea of, even though they're hitting them at the same rate, Penix is throwing them at twice the rate. And so that means that you have twice the potential to exploit those into explosive plays with Michael Penix than you did with Kirk Cousins. And that's what really raises the explosive potential for this offense, right? Explosiveness. If you've been an everydayer of this podcast for any amount of time, you know how important we emphasize explosiveness when it comes to offensive success in this league. And that's why when you look at metrics like expected points added, EPA, right, which puts a premium on explosive plays, Penix performed so highly in that metric. Like his EPA per dropback was on par with Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow this season, who were both top 10 quarterbacks in that metric this past season, according to Next Gen Stats, right? And when you have receivers like Darnell Mooney, as we talked about, after that Dallas game, where he's winning on the Calvin Ridley routes, right? The deep outs, the comebacks and whatnot. And then you saw late in the season, particularly after the bye, we started to get to see more of Drake London winning on those outside the numbers, down the field throws, the back shoulder fades, the jump balls that we had previously seen Drake London win a lot on in 22 and 23, but didn't really get to see until after the bye week in 24. And if you have those guys performing at those levels, doing those things, coupled with whoever else is on the roster, Kyle Pitts is who we're really talking about, and whoever the Falcons add to the roster in that receiver room, right? That raises the ceiling for this offense, right? And that's where you have the potential to be that top 10 offense, because you're generating those explosive numbers, right? When you look at what this offense was during its peak during Kirktober, right? That was when they were super explosive. They generated 20 plus yard plays during that 4-game stretch, which during that 4-game stretch was the 5th highest rate in the NFL. And it's not a coincidence that during that 4-game stretch, they were also one of the top scoring offenses in the NFL, averaging nearly 30 points a game, right? If you extrapolate that 4-game sample to a full 17-game sample, that puts you as a top 4, top 5 offense. That puts you on par with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who was averaging almost 30 points per game across the NFL season. And that's the team that you're chasing in order to win this division, to be able to go blow for blow with this Bucs team. You were able to do that in the 2 games that you faced the Bucs with Kirk Cousins earlier this season. Hopefully you'll be able to do the same thing with Michael Penix in the 2 games, and then also be able to do it against the vast majority of your opponents, which was not something that the Falcons were able to do outside of that 4-game stretch. The vast majority of their explosive plays came in 7 games. 41 out of their 64 explosive plays came in 7 games. Those 4 games during Kirktober, the second Saints game, the Vikings game, and the finale against the Panthers. And when you look at those 7 games, you look at the Falcons offense in terms of their explosive plays, they were the most explosive offense in the NFL just in those 7 games. You look at the other 10 games, they were basically the least explosive offense in the NFL across those other 10 games. And that was kind of the issue with the Falcons offense. It was more of an all or nothing sort of situation when it came to the explosive plays. Again, we can unpack that further when we do a deeper analysis of Zach Robinson's play calling, later in the pod, perhaps tomorrow or later this week, whenever we, whatever, schedule may vary. Off season is just like, there's a lot of things I want to talk about. We'll see when we talk about them on the podcast, but that's why you got to continue to be an everyday and make us your first listen so that you don't miss those episodes. But it's basically the idea, getting back to the subject at hand, the idea with Penix is like that ceiling is hopefully something that we saw only for a half of the season. Hopefully we can see that for an entire season with Michael Penix. And that's the path for this team potentially being that top 10 type of offense that I think they're going to need to be at this stage in the offseason in order to have a winning record and make the playoffs next upcoming season. So another way that Michael Penix is an upgrade over Kirk Cousins is in the athleticism department. And we'll talk about how that specifically could lead to a lot less negative plays for this Falcons offense in 2025 as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting, wondering, and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. And now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who's going to give your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, and everything with 100% accuracy, all so that you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. So when we talk about Michael Penix's athleticism, the two main areas where I think this matters is when it comes to creating those off structure or second reaction plays, as well as opening up the play action. Now, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the play action concepts in future episodes when we get to Zach Robinson. But certainly I think when it comes to what Penix can, because he has that superior athleticism, you can do things like bootlegs and rollouts that you weren't able to do with Kirk Cousins. Again, the key here is we're talking about these things in relation to Kirk Cousins. Now, when it comes to those second reaction plays, we saw this happen multiple times over those final 3 games of Michael Penix's start, right? Where plays that would have been sacks or other negative plays under Kirk Cousins, Penix was able to avoid the sack. He was able to extend the play and occasionally turn that into a positive play, like we saw against Carolina in the second quarter, where he did this twice, right? In the second quarter, he stepped up in the pocket, extended a play, and was able to hit a deep throw down the field to Drake London for a 26-yard gain that set up that Bijan touchdown near the end of the half. And then on the subsequent drive at the end of the half, you saw him duck under a sack from Jadeveon Clowney. Now, he didn't try to throw it to Bijan in the flat, who bobbled it, and it didn't result in a positive play, but that's taking a negative play that would have been a sack under Kirk Cousins and possibly worse, in terms of a fumble and in turnovers. He was able to turn that into either a positive or a neutral play, an incomplete pass in that case. And those are things that Penix does definitely do better than Kirk Cousins. And we saw a handful of plays where he was able to perform on that. And that matters because when it comes to young quarterbacks, they're not going to consistently have the right answers. That's one of the growing pains that you go through with a young quarterback, seeing coverages for the first time, like the Tampa 2 that we saw Michael Penix struggle with until that Week 18 finale against Carolina. All right. And there's going to be plays that they're not going to develop, right? Either because the quarterback doesn't see the read, it's well covered by the defense. The defense is able to create pressure and get home there. And so you need to have your quarterback find the right answer, whether with that off structure creation ability, whether it's moving within or outside the pocket with their legs to avoid that pressure, to buy more time for his receivers to uncover and whatnot. And so you can get to that right answer. And that's why athleticism is such a big part of the evaluation of young quarterbacks nowadays, right? More so than it used to be. Right. And before it was just like, who's got the skill sets to be the best pocket quarterback? And nowadays, because so many of these quarterbacks are being thrust into the lineup right away and don't have the time to develop, right, they're going to be forced to have to get to the right answers. And again, that's why we talk about this relative to Kirk Cousins, because I think when it comes to Michael Penix's athleticism, I think there are some people that are mistaken in thinking that Michael Penix is a great athlete relative to other starting quarterbacks in the NFL. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And I don't mean that to knock Michael Penix, but what Michael Penix is a pocket quarterback that and occasionally will make a play with his legs. And I think especially in the 2 to 3 weeks leading up to Kirk's benching, I saw a lot of people, on Twitter and other places, I think overrating Penix's athleticism in that regard. Again, relative to Kirk, Penix's athleticism is exceptional. But relative to other starting quarterbacks in the NFL, his athleticism is probably below average, right? And we can look at metrics like scramble rate to sort of indicate where Penix fits in compared to other quarterbacks in the NFL. Penix's scramble rate, according to PFF, was 3.5%. That would have been 33rd percentile among all quarterbacks over the past 2 seasons. And the league average in terms of scramble rate was 5.1%. CJ Stroud had a average scramble rate of 5.1% over the last 2 years. Now, 3.5% is the same scramble rate as Dak Prescott. And you look at other quarterbacks in the vicinity of Michael Penix. Kenny Pickett, 4.1%. Mac Jones, 3.9%. Jimmy Garoppolo, 3.8%. Geno Smith, 3.7%. Gardner Minshew, 3.6. Joe Burrow, 3.2. Tua Tagovailoa, 2.2. If you look at Matt Ryan over the course of his career, it was 2.7. And so, again, Michael Penix is a pocket quarterback that occasionally will make plays with his legs. His scramble weight in college at Washington was 2%. In Indiana, it was 2%. And so that being able to use his legs has never been a huge part of his game. When he needs to do it, he can do it. And again, it's not to sit here and say that scramble rate is the end-all, be-all stat, but I do think it does paint a fairly accurate portrait of what you will expect from Michael Penix, that he's in that tier with the so-called pocket quarterbacks that occasionally will make a play with his legs. And so I point this out because, I think there's a vocal contingent of Falcon fans that like to compare Michael Penix to Michael Vick, and they have superficial similarities. They're black, they're left-handed, they have big arms, they're both named Mike. But in terms of how they play, Penix is not anywhere close to Michael Vick. He's much closer to Matt Ryan, is basically what I'm saying. And frankly, he's basically on the level of Matt Ryan, just probably he can run faster than Matt Ryan. And so, I think people need to understand that first and foremost, that Michael Penix is a pocket quarterback that has good athleticism, but occasionally only makes plays with his legs. And so that is going to be something that we'll sort of hopefully see Michael Penix continue to do. And we'll see if he can, make more plays than, the Joe Burrows and the Dak Prescott of the world, or is that's where he's going to settle in as he gets more opportunities in this league. But, one of the things that Penix needs to do, given the type of quarterback that he is win from the pocket. And that's going to require hitting a lot of throws. And that gets us to the one area where Penix is a step back from Kirk Cousins, which is that accuracy. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, of course, everybody wants to start the new year strong, and the best way you can do so is by having more fun in 2025 than you did in 2024, and you can do that by going to more live events. And whether those live events are sports, comedy, music, theater, it doesn't matter. Whatever event is near you, Game Time, our proud sponsor, is going to make it easier for you to get tickets. Thanks to their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature is going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you don't have to worry and waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time is offering great seats at unbeatable prices, and the app's all-in pricing is going to show you the total cost up front, so you don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout. And we love the panoramic seat views because what you see is what you get, and you know exactly what you're getting when you buy. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So you've heard me say several times since drafting Michael Penix that accuracy is one of the biggest concerns. And I think, frankly, when you hear people talk about Penix and being accurate or being inaccurate, this kind of, to me, is the clear indicator of who actually sat down and watched his college film and who didn't, right? That if you watched, one or two games or the highlights and whatnot, then you're probably not going to think the accuracy is a big issue. But if you, did like I did and watched 11 of Penix's collegiate games, accuracy is going to be one of the biggest concerns near the top of your list. And so, as I discussed post-draft, I think a lot of the accuracy issues can get cleaned up if Michael Penix improves his footwork. I think his touch was also an issue, especially in that Washington game in week 17. There was a tendency in that game specifically where he was trying to, as I termed it, laser throws in rather than layer throws in. And that's something that I think he needs to improve upon. And that will help with the accuracy and sort of, because that Washington game is so interesting, because I think the tendency amongst a lot of Falcon fans is to focus on the sort of late game magic, late game poise that Michael Penix showed. And certainly that is something to applaud. But I also think, and say like, the only reason we had a chance to win that game is because of Michael Penix's late game poise and magic and whatnot. And I would also throw in the argument that I think you could easily argue that they wouldn't have been in that predicament had Penix played a little bit more effective and a little bit more efficiently in the first 3.5 quarters, because he wasn't hitting the throws that he needed to hit in that game and whatnot. So I think that's kind of the give and take with Michael Penix. And so we can look at some other stats that sort of, show a better measure of accuracy than just looking at straight up completion percent. I think Penix finished with a 58% completion rate, but some of that's on drops and all those various things. But we can look at things like adjusted completion rate from Pro Football Focus. We can look at on target percentage from Pro Football Reference. We can look at completion percentage over expected from Next Gen Stats. And when you look at adjusted completion percentage from PFF, Penix's was 70%. That would have been bottom 3 over the course of an entire season among all the starters, right? And it's the fact that Penix did not score well in that metric is not a surprise, given that we've seen a lot of young quarterbacks that eventually went on to be high-level quarterbacks in the NFL. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson were both had a 65% adjusted completion rate their rookie seasons. But then, after starting in the third year for Josh Allen in 2020 and the second year for Lamar Jackson, they've basically consistently been 74% or better since then. And that number of what that number needs to kind of be, typically the good quarterbacks are usually hitting 73, 74%. The high level quarterbacks are hitting 75, 78 or better. But that's kind of what you want that number to be. And when you look at the on target percentage from Pro Football Reference, Penix's was 67%. And the only starting quarterback that was worse than that was Anthony Richardson at 58%. And you compare that where Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder didn't shine in that metric either, but Mariota was 71% and Ridder was 75%. So Penix wasn't even, as good as those guys were. And we know that those guys were not necessarily pinpoint accurate during their time in Atlanta. And so again, that's another indicator that Penix has room to grow. Completion rate over expected from Next Gen Stats, Penix was -5.3%, which basically means that based off of where the distance he was throwing the football, that's where that gets calculated. His completion rate was 5 points below where it should have been, right? And that would have been third lowest in the NFL, right? And then when you look at the individual games with his completion percentage over expected against the Giants, it was plus 1.2%. So it was slightly above average, right? Or it was about league average, because I think the league average is about plus 1%. And that's about where Dak Prescott finished this past year. And against Washington, it was minus 11.2%. And it's funny because I remember a comment when we were talking about that game. Someone was like, why is Aaron talking about Michael Penix like he's Anthony Richardson? And guess what? Anthony Richardson's completion percentage over expected was minus 11.3%. So basically, he did perform like Anthony Richardson from an accuracy standpoint, if you're using that metric in that Washington game. And then that was slightly better against Carolina. It was minus 6.2, which the closest quarterback is like Tim Boyle, which is not a good place to be. And so that's kind of the ups and downs of Michael Penix across his 3 starts. If you look at a website like Running Backs Don't Matter, they also have completion percentage over expected. Their number had Penix at minus 4.4. And the good thing about that website is we can look at multiple years to compare. And if you go back to 2020, there's the 2 best quarterbacks that had a CPOE, completion percentage over expected, of minus 4 or worse were Cam Newton and Anthony Richardson. And those 2 guys stand out because they have the running ability to kind of make up for their deficiencies as passers, right? And when you look at the pocket quarterbacks, the so-called pocket quarterbacks that had a CPOE of minus 4 or worse, the best of that group is like Drew Lock or Cooper Rush, I guess you could say. So we're not talking about high-level quarterbacks, especially when it comes to the pocket guys that struggle in that metric. Now, if you look at the CPOE of minus 1, around that number, minus 1, minus 2, you do get some better pocket quarterbacks, but the best of that bunch is late career Ben Roethlisberger. Again, this is starting from 2020 to the current season, but Desmond Ridder, Jameis Winston, Sam Howell, Joe Flacco, post Ravens, Joe Flacco is in that sort of group of players. And so again, you're not talking about an illustrious group of pocket quarterbacks in terms of if Penix can get to a CPOE of minus 1. And sort of the only really high level quarterbacks since 2020 that have had a negative CPOE are Matt Stafford at minus 0.9, Trevor Lawrence at minus 0.9, and CJ Stroud at minus 0.8. So that's kind of telling you that you got to get that number closer to 1 or 0 to be sort of the high end quarterbacks. And so that's where we're talking about when we're talking about Penix and this offensive potential. We want him to get as close to being a top 10 quarterback as we possibly can, even if it's not necessarily realistic to expect that from a first-year starter in the NFL, although Jaden Daniels and CJ Stroud would tend to disagree with you. And then if you want to say Joe Burrow, you can put him in that group as well. So it has been done before, but you need to see these guys. You need to see Michael Penix particularly improve in the accuracy department. And again, these metrics aren't necessarily the end all be all. CPOE isn't the end all be all stat for that, but I do think it is worth paying attention, because when that stat to me is worth paying attention to when you have either a really high number or a really low number. And at this point, Penix's number is really low. And so we need to get that number up for him to be able to reach the goals that we need this offense to reach in 2025. So to me, those are the three areas where I feel like in two of those areas, arm strength and athleticism, Michael Penix is a significant upgrade over Kirk Cousins. I think in the accuracy standpoint, Michael Penix is a downgrade from Kirk Cousins, but there's room for improvement there. There's, as I said, many indicators that number should improve as Penix, grows and develops. And hopefully, he's in the lab with John Beck or whoever his quarterback coach is this offseason and really working on the footwork, because I think that's the main issue that he needs to clean up. And if he does clean that up, then you'll see that number improve significantly. And we won't be talking about this being a weakness for Michael Penix moving forward. So I think those are the reasons why I think, as we spend the next 7 to 8 months, talking about Michael Penix as, the Lisan Al-Gaib, the Quitsats Haderach, the savior of this franchise. These are some of the things that we can get excited about in the potential of Michael Penix, given what he can do for this Falcons offense and whether or not they'll reach the ceiling. Again, as I hinted at, I do want to do a deep dive on Zach Robinson, and assuming that the Falcons don't do anything, news-wise that requires me to have to talk about it. Like, my plan is to talk about that tomorrow on the podcast, and we'll get into sort of the play action. That will be a big part of the Zach Robinson conversation, or lack thereof, I guess you could say. So those are all things in store for you as you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so that you can continue to be an everydayer and make us your first listen. And of course, if you want to get the lowdown on all this weekend's playoff action, as well as the ongoing coaching surges, the latest with Mike McCarthy being out of a job, check out Locked On Cowboys. But Locked On NFL is going to have you covered for all the big stories around the NFL. And of course, you can find that on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.